The most painful words I have ever heard were not that my dream would fail, but that the people who loved me most had already decided it was impossible before I had even begun. I still remember the sound of my father's fork touching his dinner plate on that rainy Tuesday evening, because it was the moment everything changed. Our family kitchen smelled like roasted chicken and fresh cornbread. The television in the living room quietly played the local news, and my mother was asking my older sister about her promotion at the accounting firm. Everything looked like an ordinary family dinner until my father turned toward me and asked the question that I had been expecting for weeks. "So, Ethan," he said, "have you finally decided to apply for that engineering position at the manufacturing plant?" I slowly placed my glass of iced tea on the table and took a deep breath. "No," I answered honestly. "I have decided to keep building my project." The room immediately became silent. My mother lowered her eyes toward her plate, while my sister quietly leaned back in her chair as though she already knew what would happen next. My father looked at me with disappointment rather than anger, which somehow hurt even more. "Your project," he repeated slowly. "You mean that software idea you have been working on in your apartment?" I nodded. "Yes." He folded his hands together and sighed. "Ethan, you are 27 years old. You have a college degree. You are smart enough to have a stable career. Why are you wasting your time chasing something that probably is never going to work?" I had rehearsed this conversation many times in my mind, yet hearing those words from my own father still felt heavier than I expected. "Because I believe it can help people," I replied. "I am building a platform that can help local community organizations coordinate volunteers more efficiently. Small nonprofits lose thousands of volunteer hours every year because they cannot manage schedules effectively. I think I have a solution." My father shook his head before I could finish. "You think you have a solution? That is different." My mother finally spoke, her voice soft but worried. "Honey, we just want you to have security. Your father and I spend our whole lives making sure this family had stability. We do not want to see you struggle." "I know," I answered. "But if I never try, I will spend the rest of my life wondering what could have happened." My father looked directly into my eyes. "Dreams do not pay mortgages. Dreams do not cover health insurance. Dreams do not build a future." I understood why he believed that. He had spent more than 30 years working at the same utility company, rarely taking vacations, always making practical decisions. Everything he had accomplished came from discipline and consistency. He believed success meant finding a dependable career and staying with it. I respected that. What hurt was that he could not imagine success looking any different for me. "Dad," I said quietly, "every successful company started as someone's impossible idea." He gave a tired smile that carried no confidence. "Those stories are the exception, not the rule." My sister finally joined the conversation. "Maybe Dad is right," Emily said carefully. "There is nothing wrong with having a regular job while you work on your project during evenings and weekends." I looked around the table and realized something that I had never fully understood before. Nobody was asking me questions because they wanted to understand my vision. They were asking questions because they wanted me to abandon it. There was a difference, and once I recognized it, I could not ignore it anymore. "I have already made my decision," I said calmly. My father's expression became more serious. "Then you are making a mistake." Those words stayed in the air for several long seconds. I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain every hour I had spent researching community organizations, every interview I had conducted with nonprofit directors, every late night writing software code after finishing part-time consulting work. I wanted him to understand that this was not a fantasy. It was a carefully planned mission that had consumed nearly 3 years of my life. Instead, I simply nodded because I realized no amount of explanation would matter that evening. Their minds had already been made up. Dinner ended quietly. My mother hugged me before I left and whispered that she loved me. I told her I loved her too because that had never been the problem. Love had never been missing from our family. Belief had. As I walked toward my pickup truck parked along the curb, the cool spring rain had finally stopped. I sat behind the steering wheel for several minutes without starting the engine. My apartment was only 15 minutes away, but for the first time it felt much farther. During the drive home, I replayed every conversation I had ever had with my parents about my dream. They had always encouraged hard work, honesty, and responsibility. Yet every time the conversation turned toward my project, those values somehow disappeared beneath fear and doubt. When I reached my apartment, I climbed the narrow staircase, carrying nothing except my laptop bag and the weight of another disappointing evening. My apartment was small enough that I could see almost every room from the front door. A worn sofa sat beside the window. A folding table served as both my dining room and workspace, and whiteboards covered one wall with diagrams, schedules, and handwritten ideas connected by colorful markers. This was not the home of someone who had given up. It was the workshop of someone still building a future nobody else could yet see. I opened my laptop and reviewed the newest version of the software I had spent months improving. There were still bugs to fix, features to redesign, and organizations to contact. The work seemed endless, but for the first time that evening I smiled. Every line of code represented another step towards something bigger than myself. Before going to bed, I wrote one sentence on the corner of my whiteboard where I could see it every morning. It read, "One day they will understand why I never stopped." I had no idea how long that journey would take. I only knew that if I walked away from my dream because other people could not see it, I would never forgive myself. So the next morning I woke up before sunrise, made a cup of coffee, opened my laptop, and continued building a future that, at that moment, only one person in the world truly believed was possible. The months that followed settled into a routine that looked ordinary from the outside, but felt like a quiet test of endurance every single day. I woke up before 6 each morning, brewed a pot of coffee in my tiny apartment, spent 2 hours improving my software before sunrise, and then left for whatever freelance consulting job or temporary contract I had managed to secure that week. Some months I helped small businesses update their computer systems. Other weeks I repaired outdated databases or built simple websites for local companies that could not afford large technology firms. None of those jobs represented the future I wanted, but every paycheck kept the lights on and allowed me to continue investing in my own project. Every evening I returned home exhausted, heated a simple dinner, opened my laptop again, and continued writing code until well after midnight. There were nights when I questioned whether my father had been right all along. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of my keyboard and the occasional train passing a few blocks away. Sometimes I stared at the whiteboards covering my living room wall and wondered if I was slowly building something meaningful or simply creating a more complicated way to disappoint myself. Whenever those thoughts appeared, I reminded myself why I had started. During college, I had volunteered with several nonprofit organizations and community outreach programs. I had watched dedicated volunteers waste countless hours trying to coordinate schedules through endless phone calls, handwritten lists, and outdated spreadsheets. Good people wanted to help their communities, but poor organization often limited what they could accomplish. I believed technology could solve that problem. The idea had never been about becoming wealthy or famous. It had always been about making it easier for ordinary people to serve others. That purpose kept me moving forward whenever progress felt painfully slow. The software gradually became more stable, but attracting attention proved far more difficult than building the product itself. I emailed dozens of nonprofit organizations across the state, offering free demonstrations, and asking only for honest feedback. Most messages never received a reply. Some organizations politely declined. Others thanked me before explaining that they were too busy to try something new. Every rejection felt personal, even though I knew it should not. After all, they were rejecting a product, not rejecting me. Yet when you spend years pouring your heart into an idea, separating yourself from your work becomes almost impossible. On weekends, I occasionally visited my parents for dinner because despite our disagreement, I never wanted distance to become resentment. Those evenings followed a familiar pattern. My mother always welcomed me warmly and asked whether I was eating enough vegetables. My sister talked about promotions, retirement plans, and friends who had recently purchased homes. Eventually, my father asked the same question in a slightly different form. "How is the job search going?" Sometimes he tried to sound casual. Other times he sounded hopeful. He never asked how my project was progressing because in his mind it was still a temporary distraction rather than a real career. I usually answered honestly. "I am still working with consulting clients while building my platform." He nodded politely, but I could see disappointment settling across his face before the conversation moved on. One evening after dinner, my father walked outside with me as I headed toward my truck. The summer air was warm, and children from the neighborhood were riding bicycles beneath the streetlights. He stood beside the driveway with his hands in his pockets before speaking quietly. Ethan, I know you think I do not support you. I looked at him and answered carefully. Sometimes it feels that way. He sighed. I support you. I just do not support the risk you are taking. I appreciated his honesty even though it did not change anything. Dad, I replied. Every worthwhile opportunity involves some risk. He shook his head gently. Not like this. You have been chasing this idea for years. I smiled faintly. That is because some things worth building take years. Neither of us argued after that. We simply stood together in silence before saying goodnight. As I drove home, I realized my father truly believed he was protecting me. The problem was not his intentions. The problem was that fear had become stronger than imagination. Autumn arrived, bringing cooler mornings and shorter days. My savings account continued shrinking despite my careful budgeting. I stopped eating at restaurants almost entirely, canceled every unnecessary subscription, and learned how to stretch a grocery budget farther than I ever thought possible. Friends invited me to weekend trips or sporting events, and I politely declined because every dollar mattered. Some people quietly drifted away after I repeatedly turned down invitations. Others stopped asking about my project because they assumed nothing important was happening. From the outside, they were probably right. There were no newspaper articles, no investors, and no public recognition. There was only one man sitting alone in a small apartment, convinced that persistence mattered more than appearances. Still, tiny victories began appearing where nobody else could see them. A local animal shelter agreed to test an early version of my scheduling system with a handful of volunteers. After 3 weeks, the director emailed me to say they had reduced scheduling conflicts significantly. A neighborhood food pantry reported that communication among volunteers had become much smoother. Those successes were small enough that they would never appear in the news, but to me they meant everything. They proved that the idea worked outside my own imagination. I carefully recorded every piece of feedback and spent countless evenings improving the platform based on real experiences instead of assumptions. Around the same time, 2 college friends who had once shown interest in joining the project decided to accept full-time corporate jobs in another state. We met for coffee before they moved away. They encouraged me to apply with their companies, promising excellent salaries and generous benefits. I thanked them sincerely but declined. One of them smiled kindly before saying, "I hope this works out for you, Ethan." I really do. I appreciated his words because, unlike many others, he did not tell me to quit. He simply accepted that my path was different from his own. As winter approached, I stood once again in front of the whiteboard hanging above my desk. The sentence I had written months earlier remained untouched. One day they will understand why I never stopped. I read those words every morning before beginning another long day of work. I still had no guarantee that success would ever come. All I possessed was quiet determination, growing experience, and a belief that meaningful dreams are rarely built in moments when everyone is watching. More often they are built during lonely seasons when almost nobody believes they are worth pursuing. By the beginning of the following spring, I had reached the point every dream eventually faces, the moment when determination alone is no longer enough to carry the weight of reality. My savings account had fallen lower than it ever had before. Several consulting contracts had ended at the same time, and although my software continued improving, I still had not found the opportunity that could introduce it to a larger audience. Every morning, I reminded myself that progress was rarely dramatic, but even the strongest belief becomes difficult to protect when practical concerns begin arriving faster than encouraging signs. Rent was due at the end of every month, whether inspiration showed up or not. Utility bills did not care about dreams. Grocery stores expected payment before handing over food. I understood exactly why my parents valued stability, because I was living on the edge of uncertainty every single day. There were evenings when I opened my laptop and stared at the screen for several minutes before typing a single line of code, because exhaustion had quietly replaced excitement. I still believed in the mission, but belief did not erase fatigue. One afternoon, I received an email that seemed ordinary at first glance. A regional nonprofit conference was inviting technology developers to demonstrate tools that could improve community services. The event was only 90 miles away, and exhibitors were responsible for their own travel expenses and presentation materials. The registration fee represented nearly what I normally spent on groceries for 2 weeks. I sat at my desk calculating numbers over and over again. Common sense told me to save the money. My instincts told me that opportunities rarely arrived wearing bright signs that announced themselves as life-changing. After several hours of thinking, I completed the registration form and hoped I had not made another expensive mistake. During the following 2 weeks, I redesigned every part of my presentation. I rewrote demonstrations, simplified explanations, and practiced speaking until I could explain the platform naturally without relying on notes. I even borrowed a portable display from a former college professor because purchasing one was outside my budget. The night before the conference, I packed my pickup truck with careful attention, making certain every cable, monitor, brochure, and extension cord had a place. I slept only a few hours because anticipation refused to let my mind rest. The conference itself began quietly. Hundreds of people walked through the exhibition hall, stopping briefly at different booths before moving on. Some visitors smiled politely at my presentation before continuing toward larger companies with polished displays and marketing teams. Others listened for a few minutes before thanking me without leaving any contact information. By early afternoon, I wondered whether I had invested money I could not afford to lose for another disappointing experience. Then, shortly after lunch, an older gentleman stopped in front of my booth without saying a word. Instead of glancing quickly at the display, he carefully watched the live demonstration from beginning to end. After several minutes, he introduced himself as Marcus Hill. He explained that he had recently retired after leading technology initiatives for several statewide nonprofit organizations. Unlike most visitors, he did not begin by asking what my software could do. Instead, he asked why I had decided to build it. I told him about my volunteer experiences during college, about watching dedicated organizations struggle with outdated scheduling systems, and about believing that small community groups deserved access to modern technology just as much as large corporations. Marcus listened without interrupting. When I finished speaking, he smiled thoughtfully. "You are not trying to sell software," he said. "You are trying to solve a problem." I nodded. "That has always been the goal." He asked to see the platform again, this time requesting that I demonstrate every feature, including the unfinished sections that I normally avoided showing. Nearly an hour passed before he folded his notebook closed. I expected him to point out everything that was wrong with my work. Instead, he said something I had not heard from anyone in years. "You have built something with real potential." For a moment I did not answer because I wanted to make sure I had heard him correctly. Marcus continued speaking before I could respond. "The technology is not perfect yet. The interface needs refinement. Some processes are more complicated than they should be, but those are solvable problems. The important part is that you understand the people you are building this for." His words carried more weight than compliments because they included honest criticism alongside genuine encouragement. He was not praising me to be polite. He had evaluated the project carefully and believed it deserved another chance. Before leaving, Marcus handed me a business card and invited me to meet him the following week at a small coffee shop near his home. "Bring your laptop," he said. "If you are willing to listen, I think I can help you avoid mistakes that usually take years to discover." I drove back to my apartment that evening feeling something I had almost forgotten existed. Hope no longer felt like blind optimism. It felt supported by experience and wisdom from someone who had spent decades working in the exact field I hoped to serve. The following Tuesday, we met as planned. Marcus arrived carrying a notebook filled with handwritten observations about my presentation. For nearly 3 hours, we discussed everything from user experience to nonprofit budgeting, volunteer retention, leadership challenges, and long-term sustainability. He asked difficult questions that forced me to rethink assumptions I had never examined closely. At first, I felt overwhelmed, but gradually I realized he was helping strengthen the foundation rather than tearing it apart. Before we finished our meeting, Marcus looked directly at me and said, "Ethan, I cannot promise success because nobody can, but I can promise this. If you are willing to keep learning instead of protecting your pride, your chances become much better." That sentence stayed with me throughout the drive home. For the first time since leaving my parents' house months earlier, I no longer felt as though I was carrying the entire journey by myself. The road ahead remained uncertain, my financial situation had not magically improved, and the recognition I hoped for was still far away. Yet something important had changed. One experienced person had looked beyond the unfinished product, beyond the small apartment, beyond the limited resources, and had recognized the possibility that my dream deserved to exist. Sometimes that single moment of belief is enough to give someone the strength to keep walking when almost everyone else has already turned back. The weeks after meeting Marcus became the most productive period of my life because for the first time I was no longer guessing what experienced leaders expected from technology. Every Tuesday morning, we met at the same neighborhood coffee shop, always choosing a small table beside the front window where sunlight filled the room and conversations flowed without interruption. Marcus rarely told me exactly what to build. Instead, he asked questions that forced me to think more deeply about every decision. If a volunteer is 70 years old and has never used an online scheduling system, how quickly can they learn yours? If a nonprofit has only one employee, how much time will this actually save them? If your software disappeared tomorrow, what problem would return immediately? Those questions completely changed the way I approached development. I stopped building features because they seemed impressive and started building solutions that real people could understand within minutes. The platform gradually became simpler, cleaner, and far more practical than the version I had originally imagined. At the same time, I continued visiting the small organizations that had agreed to test early versions of the software. Instead of simply asking whether they liked it, I watched them use it with their own volunteers. I noticed where they hesitated, where they became confused, and where they smiled because something finally worked the way they hoped it would. Every observation became another improvement when I returned home each evening. Slowly, I began replacing assumptions with experience. Several months later, Marcus suggested something that surprised me. "You have enough successful pilot programs now," he said while reviewing notes inside his worn leather notebook. "It is time to stop thinking like someone asking for permission. Start thinking like someone offering a valuable service." Those words stayed with me long after our meeting ended. I realized I had been approaching every conversation expecting people to reject my idea. Without realizing it, I had been presenting my work with hesitation because years of doubt had quietly become part of my own thinking. Marcus encouraged me to speak with confidence that matched the quality of the work itself. Following his advice, I redesigned my presentation materials again, replacing technical language with stories from real organizations that had benefited from the platform. Instead of discussing software functions, I described volunteers arriving on time, community kitchens serving more families, and nonprofit directors spending less time organizing schedules and more time helping people. The difference was immediate. Organizations responded more warmly because they understood the impact rather than the technology. During that same period, one of the largest community outreach networks in our county agreed to conduct a 3-month pilot program across several locations. It was the biggest opportunity one had ever received. The organization coordinated hundreds of volunteers each month, and if the system performed well, many others would notice. I spent days preparing for the launch, checking every detail repeatedly because I understood how much depended on this single opportunity. The first few weeks were far from perfect. Unexpected issues appeared as more users joined the platform. Some volunteers forgot passwords. Others accidentally scheduled themselves twice. A few older participants struggled with unfamiliar technology. In the past, those problems would have discouraged me. Now I approached each challenge differently. I answered support emails personally, visited offices whenever necessary, and listened patiently before making improvements. Rather than seeing criticism as failure, I began treating every question as valuable information. By the end of the second month, the number of support requests had fallen dramatically, while user satisfaction continued rising. One Friday afternoon, I received a phone call from the director of the outreach network. She thanked me for responding so quickly whenever problems appeared and explained that volunteer participation had increased because scheduling had become much easier. After ending the call, I remained seated at my desk for several minutes without speaking. It was the first time a large organization had measured real improvements after using something I had created. The achievement felt quiet but deeply meaningful. A few days later, Marcus invited me to lunch at a small family-owned restaurant downtown. As we finished eating, he slid a folded newspaper across the table. Near the bottom of one page was a short article about innovative technology supporting local nonprofit organizations. My platform was mentioned only briefly, almost hidden within the story, but seeing those printed words made my heart race. It was the first public recognition my work had ever received. Marcus smiled as he watched me read the article twice. Do not underestimate small beginnings, he said. Many important stories begin with a paragraph that almost everyone else ignores. I carried that newspaper home and carefully placed it inside a folder where I kept important milestones. A week later, another unexpected opportunity arrived. Olivia Carter, a reporter from a local community newspaper, contacted me after learning about the Outreach Network's results. She asked whether I would be willing to demonstrate the platform and explain why I had started building it. We met inside one of the nonprofit offices where volunteers were actively using the system. Instead of focusing on me, Olivia spent most of her time interviewing the volunteers and directors. She wanted to know whether the software genuinely made their work easier. Listening to them describe improvements I had only hoped for filled me with quiet gratitude. They spoke about smoother communication, fewer scheduling mistakes, and more time spent serving families instead of organizing paperwork. Those voices mattered far more than anything I could have said myself. A few days after the interview, Olivia published a thoughtful article highlighting how local organizations were using practical technology to strengthen community service. My photograph appeared beside several volunteers rather than standing alone, exactly the way I preferred it. The story did not suddenly transform my life overnight, but it reached people who had never heard my name before. Emails began arriving from organizations asking questions, requesting demonstrations, and wondering whether the platform could help their own teams. For the first time since leaving my parents' dining table, the momentum I had imagined for years was finally becoming visible. The apartment where I had once worked alone late into the night no longer felt like a place where impossible dreams quietly waited. It had become the headquarters of something steadily growing, one conversation, one improvement, and one organization at a time. Even though my family still had no idea that the future they believed could never exist was slowly beginning to take shape just beyond their view. The first sign that everything was beginning to change arrived on an ordinary Monday morning when my email inbox filled faster than I could answer the messages. Several nonprofit directors had shared Olivia Carter's article with colleagues across the county, and one recommendation quietly led to another. By the end of the week, I had scheduled more demonstrations than I had completed during the previous 6 months combined. Every organization faced different challenges, yet they all wanted the same thing. They wanted to spend less time managing schedules and more time serving people. I realized that my years of listening had prepared me for these conversations far better than any sales presentation ever could. Instead of promising unrealistic results, I explained exactly what the platform could accomplish and what still required improvement. That honesty created trust, and trust opened doors that polished marketing never could. Marcus often reminded me that sustainable success grows through consistent credibility rather than dramatic promises. I repeated those words before every meeting because they kept me focused on serving people instead of chasing recognition. During the following months, the platform expanded from a handful of organizations to dozens throughout the region. Volunteer coordinators began recommending it to one another without any encouragement from me. Directors invited me to community events where I met people whose lives had been quietly improved because local organizations could now operate more efficiently. Listening to those stories reminded me why I had refused to abandon the project during the difficult years. One afternoon, an elderly volunteer thanked me because the new scheduling system made it much easier for her to continue serving at the neighborhood food pantry despite her limited experience with computers. A youth program director explained that better volunteer coordination allowed them to extend tutoring hours for local students. None of those conversations appeared in newspapers, yet they meant more than any headline because they proved the work truly mattered. Late one Friday afternoon, I received a phone call that left me completely speechless. The Office of Community Development at City Hall had been following the success of several nonprofit organizations using my platform. They were preparing a citywide initiative to strengthen cooperation among volunteer groups and wanted to evaluate whether my system could support the effort. At first, I assumed someone had called the wrong number. After confirming my name several times, the coordinator laughed kindly and assured me that they had reached exactly the person they intended to contact. We arranged a formal presentation for the following month. After ending the call, I remained seated at my desk, staring at the silent phone in disbelief. For years, I had imagined opportunities like this, but imagining something and hearing it become reality were completely different experiences. My first instinct was to call Marcus. He listened quietly while I explained every detail before saying, "Congratulations, Ethan. Now remember something important. They are not inviting you because they are doing you a favor. They are inviting you because your work has already demonstrated value." His confidence steadied my own. We spent the next several weeks preparing every detail together. We refined demonstrations, reviewed possible questions, and discussed practical concerns that city officials might raise. Marcus never allowed me to settle for vague answers. If I claimed the platform improved efficiency, he expected me to provide measurable evidence. If I described community impact, he insisted I support every statement with real examples. By the time presentation day arrived, I felt prepared not because I had memorized a speech, but because I thoroughly understood the problem we were solving. The meeting at City Hall lasted nearly 2 hours. Representatives from several departments attended alongside leaders from community organizations already using the platform. Rather than beginning with technical explanations, I invited 2 nonprofit directors to describe their own experiences. Hearing respected community leaders explain how volunteer participation had increased carried far more influence than any presentation slides I could have created. Questions followed one after another about security, accessibility, long-term maintenance, and future expansion. Thanks to months of preparation with Marcus, I answered calmly and honestly. When the meeting concluded, one official shook my hand and said they would contact me after completing their evaluation. I drove home without trying to predict the outcome because I had learned that meaningful opportunities often required patience. 2 weeks later, another call arrived. The city had approved a pilot partnership involving multiple departments and community organizations. I thanked the coordinator, ended the conversation, and quietly sat back in my chair. There was no dramatic celebration. There was only deep gratitude for every difficult morning, every rejection, every lonely evening spent improving the platform while wondering whether anyone would ever believe in it. News of the partnership spread quickly through local media because the initiative represented a new approach to strengthening volunteer services across the city. Olivia Carter published another article explaining how community organizations and city leaders would work together using technology developed by a local entrepreneur. This time the article included a larger photograph and a detailed interview discussing the years of preparation behind the project. Friends I had not spoken with in years began sending messages of congratulations. Former professors reached out to say they had followed my progress with pride. Even a few past consulting clients contacted me simply to say they were happy to see my work receiving recognition. Then, on a quiet Sunday evening, something happened that I had never expected. My phone rang, and the caller identification displayed my parents' home number. I answered with my usual greeting, expecting another family dinner invitation. Instead, my mother spoke first. Her voice sounded both excited and uncertain. "Ethan," she said gently, "your father and I were watching the local evening news." She paused for a moment before continuing. "They interviewed you at City Hall today." I looked across my apartment toward the same whiteboard that had witnessed years of uncertainty. For a brief moment, I could not find the right words. My mother continued softly. "We did not know things had grown this much." Before I answered, I heard my father in the background asking quietly if she would put the call on speaker. For the first time since I had left their dinner table years earlier, it felt as though they were no longer speaking to the son they worried about. They were speaking to someone whose quiet persistence had finally become impossible to overlook, even before the rest of the city fully understood what was only beginning to unfold. After ending the call with my parents, I remained standing in the middle of my apartment long after the screen on my phone had gone dark. The room looked exactly the same as it had the day I first moved in. The folding table still served as my desk. The whiteboards were still filled with diagrams, notes, and ideas that had slowly evolved over the years. The old sofa beside the window had not become any more comfortable. Nothing around me had changed overnight, yet everything somehow felt different. For the first time since beginning this journey, my parents had seen evidence of my work before hearing my explanation. They had watched complete strangers describe its value before I had the chance to defend it. That simple difference mattered more than I expected because the conversation was no longer about whether my dream was realistic. It had become a conversation about something that already existed. A few days later, my mother invited me to Sunday dinner. Her voice carried the same warmth it always had, but I sensed a quiet hesitation beneath every sentence. I accepted without asking whether she had a reason beyond simply wanting the family together. When Sunday afternoon arrived, I drove the familiar route to my parents' house with emotions I could not easily describe. Part of me felt hopeful. Another part remained cautious because years of disappointment do not disappear after one television interview. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed my father's pickup truck already parked beside the garage. The front yard looked exactly as it had throughout my childhood: neatly trimmed grass, flower beds that my mother cared for every spring, and the maple tree my father planted when Emily and I were still in elementary school. Walking toward the front door felt strangely familiar and completely new at the same time. My mother greeted me with a long hug before leading me into the kitchen, where the smell of pot roast and fresh rolls filled the house. Emily was already helping set the table. She smiled warmly and asked about my week with genuine curiosity instead of polite conversation. It was a small change, but I noticed it immediately. My father entered the kitchen carrying a pitcher of iced tea. For a brief moment, we simply looked at each other. Then he walked forward and offered a firm handshake before quietly saying, "It is good to see you, son." During dinner, the conversation remained surprisingly normal. We talked about the changing weather, Emily's work, neighborhood events, and a charity fundraiser that had recently taken place downtown. Nobody mentioned the television interview or City Hall until dessert was served. Finally, my father placed his coffee cup on the table and looked directly at me. "I watched your interview twice," he said calmly. I nodded without speaking. "You explained your project very well." There was another brief silence before he continued. "I also looked up the organizations they mentioned." I felt my heart beating a little faster because I had no idea where the conversation was leading. My father leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together exactly as he had done years earlier during the dinner that changed everything. This time, however, his expression was completely different. There was no disappointment in his eyes. There was thoughtfulness. "Those organizations are doing important work," he said. "They all spoke very highly of you." I smiled softly. "They have been wonderful partners." My mother reached across the table and gently touched my hand. "Why did you never tell us everything had grown this much?" I answered honestly because there was no reason to protect anyone from the truth anymore. "I tried to tell you what I hoped it could become. After a while, I realized it was better to spend my energy building it than trying to convince people before there was something they could see." Nobody interrupted. Emily lowered her eyes for a moment before quietly saying, "I think we kept waiting for proof instead of trusting you." My father slowly nodded. "She is right." Hearing those words from him carried more weight than I expected. He looked toward the dining room window for several seconds before speaking again. "I have spent my entire life believing that my responsibility as a father was to protect my family from unnecessary risks. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that protecting you meant discouraging you." His voice remained steady, but I could hear genuine reflection behind every sentence. Watching that interview made me realize something. I never actually asked whether your idea was helping people. I only asked whether it would succeed financially. I appreciated his honesty because it came without excuses. He was not pretending the past had been different. He was acknowledging it exactly as it happened. I answered carefully. "I always understood why you worried. What hurt was feeling like you believed I could never build something worthwhile." My father looked directly into my eyes. "I know." Those two simple words carried years of unspoken understanding. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply accepted the truth. After dinner, we moved onto the back porch where the evening air was cool and peaceful. My father and I sat quietly while my mother and Emily cleared the dishes inside. After several minutes, he spoke again. "Marcus Hill," he said unexpectedly. "The man they interviewed alongside you." I recognized his name. I smiled. "He has become a mentor." My father nodded thoughtfully. "I looked him up after the news broadcast. He has spent decades helping nonprofit organizations across the state." He paused before continuing. "I am glad someone believed in you when I did not." I looked across the backyard where I had spent countless afternoons playing baseball as a child. "I wish it had been both of you," I admitted gently. My father lowered his eyes for a moment before quietly answering, "So do I." There was no dramatic apology, no emotional speech, and no instant resolution. Instead, there was something much more meaningful. Two people who loved each other had finally begun speaking honestly without trying to win an argument. As I drove home later that evening, I realized reconciliation does not usually arrive through one extraordinary conversation. It begins with small moments of humility, patient listening, and the willingness to admit that love alone is not always enough if it is not accompanied by trust. For the first time in many years, I no longer felt that my parents were standing on the opposite side of my journey. They had not yet walked the entire road beside me, but they had finally taken the first step in my direction, and somehow that made the future feel brighter than ever before. Over the next several months, I discovered that rebuilding trust inside a family was remarkably similar to building the software that had changed my life. Neither process happened through one dramatic breakthrough. Both required patience, consistency, honest conversations, and countless small improvements that gradually created something stronger than before. My partnership with the city continued expanding as more community organizations joined the platform. Every new group brought different challenges, different volunteers, and different ideas that helped improve the system. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by growth, I finally began enjoying the responsibility because I was no longer trying to prove that my dream deserved to exist. Now my attention was focused entirely on making it as useful as possible for the people who depended on it every day. Marcus remained my trusted mentor, although our weekly meetings gradually became less about solving technical problems and more about discussing leadership. He often reminded me that success creates new responsibilities. People will remember how you treat them long after they forget what your software looked like, he told me one Tuesday morning as we finished our coffee. Build relationships with the same care you use to build your platform. I carried those words into every meeting, every presentation, and every conversation that followed. At the same time, something quietly began changing inside my family. Sunday dinners became a regular tradition again, but they no longer felt uncomfortable. Instead of asking whether I planned to look for a different career, my father started asking about the nonprofit organizations I was working with. He wanted to understand what problems they faced, how volunteers coordinated large events, and why certain features mattered more than others. His questions no longer sounded like challenges. They sounded like genuine curiosity. One afternoon, he surprised me by asking whether he could visit my office. I smiled because the word office still felt unusual to me. Although I had moved out of my apartment into a modest workspace downtown, I still thought of myself as the same person who had spent years writing code at a folding table beside a living room window. A few days later, my parents arrived together. My office was simple but welcoming, with several desks, meeting space for nonprofit partners, and whiteboards covered with plans for future improvements. My mother slowly walked through the room, studying photographs hanging on one wall that showed volunteers using the platform during food drives, neighborhood cleanups, literacy programs, and community events. She paused in front of one picture for several seconds before quietly saying, "You always said this was about helping people." I nodded. "It always was." She smiled gently and replied, "I understand that much better now." My father spent most of the visit talking with members of my small team. Rather than asking about revenue or expansion, he asked them why they had decided to join the company. Their answers surprised even me. One employee explained that she had left a larger technology firm because she wanted her work to make a visible difference in local communities. Another said he appreciated building something that solved practical problems instead of simply increasing profits. Listening to them, I realized that the mission I had carried alone for so many years had become something shared by many people. As we prepared to leave, my father stopped beside the whiteboard in my office. It was covered with ideas for future improvements, upcoming community events, and handwritten notes collected during meetings with nonprofit leaders. He smiled quietly before saying, "This reminds me of your apartment." I laughed. Some habits never change. He nodded thoughtfully. I am glad they did not. Those simple words stayed with me long after they drove away because they represented more than approval. They represented understanding. A few weeks later, the city organized its annual community service recognition ceremony, bringing together volunteers, nonprofit leaders, educators, business owners, and local officials. I attended expecting another opportunity to celebrate the organizations doing extraordinary work throughout the year. Instead, shortly after the program began, the Master of Ceremonies announced a special recognition for innovation in community engagement. My name was called, and for a brief moment I remained seated because I assumed someone else must share the same name. Marcus, sitting beside me, smiled and gently tapped my arm. As I walked toward the stage, I noticed my parents sitting several rows away. They had accepted an invitation without telling me because they wanted to surprise me. My father looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not relief. It was not disbelief. It was unmistakable pride. The mayor presented a plaque recognizing the contribution our platform had made in strengthening volunteer coordination across the city. After accepting the award, I was invited to say a few words. Standing behind the podium, I looked across the audience and saw hundreds of faces representing organizations that had trusted an idea once dismissed as unrealistic. I thanked the volunteers whose generosity inspired the project, the nonprofit leaders who had taken a chance on an unknown developer, my dedicated team, and Marcus for believing in both the mission and the person behind it. Then I paused for a moment before speaking from the heart. I said that every meaningful dream begins as something only one person can fully see, and that perseverance becomes much easier when even one other person chooses to believe alongside you. I did not mention past disappointments or old disagreements because they no longer define the story. Growth had replaced resentment. Understanding had replaced frustration. As the audience applauded, I glanced toward my parents once more. My mother wiped away quiet tears while my father stood and applauded with everyone else. In that moment, I realized the recognition from the city was deeply meaningful, but the greater reward was witnessing the people who had once feared my future now celebrating it without hesitation. Their belief had arrived later than I once hoped, yet it arrived. Sincerely, and sometimes sincere understanding, even when delayed, becomes one of the greatest gifts a family can ever share. Life gradually settled into a rhythm that I had once believed existed only in my imagination. The city partnership continued growing beyond its original goals, and organizations from neighboring counties began reaching out after hearing about the improvements local volunteers had experienced. My team expanded carefully because I refused to grow faster than we could responsibly support the people depending on our platform. Every new employee spent time visiting nonprofit organizations before writing a single line of code or answering a single customer email. I wanted everyone to understand that we were not simply building technology. We were helping neighbors serve neighbors more effectively. That purpose remained the foundation of every decision we made. As the months passed, my calendar became busier than ever before, yet I made a promise to myself that I would never become too busy for my family again. Sunday dinners remained a priority, and they slowly transformed into something I had missed for years. We laughed more often. We listened more carefully. We asked questions because we genuinely wanted to understand one another instead of trying to change each other's minds. My mother often prepared the same recipes I had loved as a child, and my father gradually developed a habit of asking me to arrive a little earlier so we could sit together on the back porch before everyone else came. Those quiet conversations became some of the most meaningful moments of my week. One Saturday afternoon, he invited me to help repair the old wooden fence behind the house. As we measured boards and replaced weathered sections, we talked about ordinary things that somehow felt extraordinary simply because we had learned how to listen. He asked about new features being added to the platform, and I asked about his retirement plans. We laughed when he admitted that technology still confused him sometimes, although he proudly told me he had successfully learned how to use the volunteer scheduling system himself while helping at a local food pantry. Hearing that surprised me. "You are volunteering now?" I asked with a smile. He nodded. "Your mother convinced me to give it a try." Then he paused before adding something that made me stop working for a moment. "After seeing everything your platform has helped accomplish, I wanted to understand the people who inspired you all those years ago." I looked at him quietly because I knew those words represented much more than curiosity. They represented growth. My father had not simply accepted my career. He had chosen to experience the world that had given birth to my dream. A few weeks later, our extended family gathered for my grandmother's 85th birthday celebration at a community banquet hall. Relatives traveled from different parts of the state, including several aunts, uncles, and cousins I had not seen in years. In the past, family gatherings often included awkward questions about work or gentle suggestions that I should consider finding something more stable. This gathering felt entirely different. Several relatives approached me to say they had read newspaper articles about the city partnership or seen interviews online. Others wanted to know how volunteer organizations were using the platform in their own communities. I answered every question with gratitude because I never wanted success to become a reason for pride or distance. The most memorable moment of the afternoon arrived unexpectedly during my grandmother's birthday toast. My father stood to thank everyone for coming before smiling in my direction. "Before we celebrate, Mom," he said, "there is something I have wanted to say for a long time." The room became quiet. He looked toward me with complete sincerity. "Many of you know that Ethan chose a path that I did not understand for many years. I believed I was protecting him by encouraging him to choose something safer. Looking back, I realized that I spent too much time measuring his future by my own experiences instead of trusting his character." He paused briefly before continuing. "Today our family is proud of what he has accomplished, not only because people know his work, but because he never stopped treating others with kindness even when some of us doubted him. I learned an important lesson from my son. Sometimes believing in someone is the greatest gift you can give before they have anything to prove." No one spoke for several seconds after he finished. Then the room filled with warm applause. I felt deeply humbled because I knew how difficult those words must have been for him to say publicly. After the celebration ended, my father and I carried folding chairs back into storage together. As we worked, I thanked him quietly for what he had shared. He smiled and shook his head. "I was not giving you a compliment," he replied. "I was telling the truth." Those simple words stayed with me long afterward. They reminded me that genuine humility does not weaken a person. It strengthens every relationship it touches. During the following months, the platform expanded into additional cities, bringing new partnerships and new opportunities to improve community service throughout the region. Although the work became larger than I had ever imagined, I remained committed to visiting nonprofit organizations personally whenever possible. I never wanted success to separate me from the people whose challenges had inspired the journey in the first place. Every time I walked into a volunteer center and watched neighbors working together, I remembered the tiny apartment where everything had begun, the folding table that served as my desk, the whiteboard filled with impossible plans, and the lonely mornings when belief existed only inside my own heart. Those memories no longer carried sadness. Instead, they reminded me that every worthwhile journey begins long before anyone else notices it. Looking around my life now, I realized that the greatest transformation had not been the recognition, the partnerships, or the growing success. The greatest transformation had taken place inside my family. We had learned that love becomes stronger when it is supported by trust, that honest conversations heal more than silent assumptions, and that the courage to admit past mistakes can create a future far better than anyone once imagined. Those lessons became more valuable than any award hanging on my office wall because they represented victories that could never be measured by headlines or applause. They could only be measured by the quiet peace that finally existed whenever our family gathered around the same dinner table where years earlier almost no one believed that my dream could become reality. 1 year later, I found myself standing on the stage of the annual State Community Leadership Conference, looking across an audience filled with nonprofit directors, volunteers, educators, business owners, and public officials from cities I had never imagined reaching when this journey began. Our platform had expanded well beyond the county where everything started. Hundreds of organizations now relied on it every day to coordinate volunteers, strengthen local partnerships, and serve thousands of families across the state. Reporters often asked me what it felt like to see my work recognized by so many people, but the truth was that recognition had gradually become the least interesting part of the story. Recognition could fill a newspaper article or a television interview. It could bring invitations to conferences and meetings. It could introduce my name to people I had never met. Yet none of those things compared to the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the dream, which once existed only inside my own heart, had become something capable of improving the lives of others. After the conference ended, I returned home instead of attending another networking dinner because my parents had invited the family to celebrate Thanksgiving together. That invitation meant more to me than any professional event because our holiday gatherings had become symbols of something we had rebuilt together. As I drove toward the house where I had grown up, memories accompanied every familiar street. I remembered leaving that same neighborhood years earlier carrying little more than determination and uncertainty. I remembered questioning whether anyone would ever understand why I refused to give up. Now those same roads led me back to a place filled not with doubt, but with welcome. My mother greeted me at the front door with the same warm embrace she had given me throughout my life. My sister was already in the kitchen, helping prepare dinner while laughing with my father about a recipe that had somehow become a family tradition. The atmosphere felt peaceful in a way that would have seemed impossible years before. During the meal, we shared stories from the past year. Emily talked about mentoring younger employees at her company. My mother described new friendships she had formed while volunteering at the local library. My father enthusiastically told everyone about the community food pantry, where he continued serving every week. He smiled proudly while explaining how much easier volunteer scheduling had become. Everyone laughed when he admitted that he now enjoyed teaching new volunteers how to use the same platform he had once questioned. Watching him speak with such enthusiasm filled me with quiet gratitude because it reminded me how completely people can grow when they allow themselves to learn. After dinner, we gathered in the living room, where family photographs covered the walls. My father disappeared for a few moments before returning with an old cardboard storage box. He placed it carefully on the coffee table and opened it with a thoughtful smile. Inside were photographs from my childhood, school projects, Little League trophies, report cards, and handwritten birthday cards that my mother had saved for decades. Near the bottom of the box, my father pulled out a faded notebook. I recognized it immediately. It was one of the first notebooks where I had sketched early ideas for the volunteer platform years before I ever wrote the first line of software. I had completely forgotten that I left it at my parents' house. My father gently handed it back to me. "I found this while cleaning the attic a few months ago," he said. "I read some of your notes." He paused before continuing. "You were thinking about helping communities long before I realized it." I slowly turned the worn pages filled with rough drawings, handwritten observations, and ideas that now seemed almost unbelievably simple compared to what the platform had become. Yet the mission written across the first page had never changed. It read, "Help good people spend more time helping others." I smiled because after all these years, that sentence still described everything I hoped to accomplish. My father looked at me with the same honesty that had transformed our relationship over the past year. "I used to think success meant convincing you to choose a safer path," he said quietly. "Now I understand that success also means having the courage to follow the right path, even when other people cannot see where it leads." I thanked him, but before I could say anything else, he gently interrupted. "No, son," he replied. "Thank you for teaching me that believing in someone should never depend on whether the outcome is guaranteed." Those words settled into the room with a quiet peace that no one felt the need to interrupt. Later that evening, after saying goodbye, I stepped outside onto the front porch before walking to my truck. The autumn air felt cool, and the neighborhood was calm beneath a sky filled with bright stars. My father followed me outside just as he had done years earlier after one difficult family dinner. This time, neither of us carried disappointment. We stood together for several moments without speaking because silence no longer felt uncomfortable. Finally, he placed a hand on my shoulder and smiled. "I am proud of the man you have become," he said. I smiled back and answered with complete honesty. "I am proud of us." He nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. We had both changed. We had both learned. We had both chosen understanding instead of pride. As I drove home, I realized that people often imagine success as the moment the world finally notices your name. There is certainly joy in seeing years of effort recognized, but public recognition is only one chapter in a much larger story. The greater victory is becoming the kind of person who remains faithful to meaningful work even when nobody is watching. The greater reward is discovering that forgiveness can rebuild relationships once damaged by fear and misunderstanding. The greatest blessing of all is watching the people you love grow alongside you instead of remaining trapped by yesterday's assumptions. Looking back, I no longer wish that my journey had been easier because every difficult season taught lessons that comfort never could. Those lonely mornings, uncertain evenings, unanswered emails, financial sacrifices, and quiet acts of perseverance shaped not only the future I eventually built, but also the character required to lead it well. If someone listening to my story feels discouraged because the people closest to them cannot yet understand their dream, I hope they remember one simple truth that changed my life. You do not need everyone to believe in your future before you begin building it. Sometimes all you need is the courage to keep taking the next faithful step until your actions speak more clearly than your explanations ever could. In the end, the greatest achievement was never that countless people eventually learned my name. It was that my family finally learned to see the person I had been trying to become all along, and together we discovered that trust, once restored through humility, patience, and love, becomes a legacy far more valuable than success alone.